Hi everybody, welcome to Rain Shadows channel, where stories whisper with the rain. Before we begin, make sure everything is ready for a deep sleep. Close your eyes, relax your body, and let your mind drift with each tale. Don't forget to like and subscribe channel so you won't miss the next video. Now come with me into the darkness.
We found the house by accident. It wasn't in our price range, at least not what we expected for something that looked like it came out of a vintage countryside magazine. 2 stories, wraparound porch, original woodwork. A small garden with overgrown roses, like something left behind by time itself. It even had one of those brass door knockers shaped like a lion's head. The listing said it had been sitting empty for a few years. The owner had passed away, and the remaining family wanted it sold fast. No inspections, no bidding war, just the keys and a clean signature. We didn't think twice. It felt like a gift, a reset. After the stress of the city, the cramped apartment, the late-night sirens, and the blinking neon lights, this was exactly what we needed. Peace, space, somewhere quiet to just... The first night, everything felt fine. Empty, sure, but peaceful. We set up an air mattress in the bedroom and drank wine straight from the bottle, laughing like we were on vacation. The windows creaked a little in the wind. The house groaned as it cooled from the day's heat, but that was normal. That's what old houses do. But by the third night we noticed something. Not a sound. Not a shadow. A feeling. Like we weren't alone when we slept. Not in a threatening way. Not at first. Just watched. I'd wake up with the heavy weight of someone's attention pressing on my chest. I'd sit up, heart racing, but the room would be silent. My partner would be asleep beside me, undisturbed. Then, she started dreaming. Every night, she'd mumble things, scratch at her arms, jerk upright at 3 a.m. and swear someone was in the room. She kept talking about eyes, huge, unblinking, hovering just outside the reach of the bedside lamp. "I think the house is watching us," she said one morning, rubbing her temples like the thought gave her a migraine. I laughed, but not because it was funny, because I had felt it too. We decided to set up a camera in the bedroom. It wasn't about ghosts or proof or paranoia, it was for peace of mind. We just wanted to see what was really happening at night. Maybe she was sleepwalking, maybe I was snoring, maybe, hopefully, it was just nothing. That night, we left the camera running. And the next morning we watched the footage. Nothing for hours, just shifting shadows and the rise and fall of our breathing. Then at 3:12 a.m, the motion sensor kicked in. And in the corner of the screen, just for 2 frames, there was something. 2 small glimmers. Like eyes catching the faintest bit of light far back in the darkest corner of the room. Then they blinked and vanished. We told ourselves it was a glitch. Dust reflecting off the lens, light bouncing from the window, pixel distortion, anything but what it looked like, 2 eyes, hovering silently in the darkest part of the room. We watched the clip over and over again, frame by frame. The glimmers didn't match the pattern of light from any known source. They didn't flicker, they didn't shift. They simply... once, slowly, and then they were gone. That night, we didn't sleep well. The camera stayed on. We both went to bed fully clothed, backs pressed together, eyes wide open, staring into the corners of the room like children afraid of the dark. We left every light on. The air was still, unmoving. But the silence carried weight, like the house was listening. At 3:12 a.m, the hallway light dimmed, just slightly. Not enough to notice unless you were watching. We both felt it. A drop in temperature. Pulling, stretching kind of pressure in the chest. Like the air got thicker. Heavier. She whispered to me in the dark. "He's in the room." The next morning, we checked the footage. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. The camera showed the moment we fell asleep. Time-lapse, silent. Then, again, motion detected at 3:12 a.m. The corner of the room darkened unnaturally, as if a shadow had stepped forward from the wall itself. And there they were. 2 glowing eyes, low to the ground, unmoving, watching. They didn't belong to any animal. They were too far apart, too level, too knowing. And for the first time we saw movement, a faint shifting of limbs, not walking, not crawling, just repositioning, like someone adjusting their posture after sitting still for too long. But here's what made me feel sick. Neither of us moved, not even a stir, until both of us at the same time sat up. Not startled, not groggy. We sat up in unison and turned our heads slowly toward the camera. Our eyes were open, but we weren't awake. Our faces were blank, our mouths slightly parted, and we stared directly into the lens for 27 seconds. Then we both laid back down, perfectly in sync, and the eyes in the corner vanished. The next morning we didn't remember any of it. When I showed her the footage, she started crying. She couldn't explain it, and neither could I. We hadn't taken anything. No pills, no sleepwalking history, no history of seizures or disorders. Just a house that now felt less like a home and more like a stage. And something in the walls, in the darkness, behind the plaster and brick, was watching the performance. It didn't matter that we left the lights on. The dark came anyway. We stopped checking the footage every morning, not because we weren't scared, but because we were afraid of what we'd find. For a while, we tried pretending it wasn't happening. During the day, we stayed busy, gardening, painting, baking bread we never ate. We made jokes. We left the bedroom door open. We told ourselves we just had a string of bad nights. But as dusk crept in each evening, that false sense of normalcy faded like sunlight on the hallway wallpaper. Then one morning we woke up to find every mirror in the house had fogged over. The windows were clear. The air was dry. But the mirrors were clouded from the inside, like someone had been breathing on them from within. Later that day, the camera app on my phone pinged. Motion detected, 3:12 a.m. I didn't open it, not right away. Instead, I went to the hallway and looked at the camera itself. It had been turned, slightly, not by accident, not like it had slipped, but like someone wanted to change the angle, just a little, enough to see something new. That night, I set up 2 more cameras, one in the hallway, one in the living room, just to be sure. The next morning, I opened the footage. What I saw didn't make sense. In the living room camera, I was sitting on the couch at 3:14 a.m., wide awake, staring at nothing. But I had no memory of it. In the hallway footage, my partner was standing outside the bedroom, just smiling, staring into the corner as if listening to someone whisper. Then, together, we walked into the kitchen. We stood there for 5 minutes, still, silent. Then we moved to the dining table, sat across from each other, and began writing. There was no paper, no pens, but our hands moved in the air, mimicking the shape of words. When I checked the bedroom footage from the same time, we were both in bed, unmoving, sleeping. But we couldn't be in 2 places at once, unless... No, I didn't want to finish that thought. Later that day, we found scratches on the bedroom walls. Not deep, not chaotic. They were symbols, simple, circular, geometric, repeating, almost like a language. Neither of us remembered seeing them before. That night, we locked every door, unplugged every camera, turned off our phones, and still we woke up to a new recording. Not from our devices, from an old VHS tape we'd found in the attic weeks ago. Unmarked, dusty. We hadn't touched it. But it was playing on the living room TV when we woke up. The footage? Us. Sitting on the bed, smiling. Behind us, just barely visible in the grainy static, a figure in the corner. Not quite man, not quite shadow, just watching. We tried to leave. I remember the exact moment we made the decision. It was noon. The sun was out. Birds chirped on the fence like nothing was wrong. I packed a bag without looking at what I was throwing in. My partner stood by the front door, keys in hand, hands trembling. We walked out without looking back. But when we reached the end of the driveway, something felt off. The world looked the same, but the sky had gone too still. There was no wind, no sound. The air was thick, like the pause between 2 heartbeats. I turned back toward the house, and the lights in the bedroom were on. We had turned everything off. Then the front door opened, by itself. We didn't go back inside, not immediately, but somehow we never made it to the car. There's no memory of turning around, no moment where we decided to give up. Just a gap, a cut in the reel of the day. And the next thing I knew, we were both sitting at the kitchen table again, breathing, smiling, like nothing had happened, except the scratches were back. More of them now, all across the bedroom walls, the ceiling, Even the back of the closet door, as if someone had been trapped inside, writing in circles again and again. We tried painting over them, but they bled through. We tried covering the mirrors again, but we'd always wake up to find one uncovered. Always the one in the hallway, always angled toward the bedroom. Then came the laughter. It started low, soft, like a child giggling from under the bed, then louder, higher, closer. Only at 3:12 a.m., only when we were too tired to keep our eyes open. One night we set every camera to record. We didn't sleep. We sat awake, waiting, holding hands in the dark like people preparing for impact. At 3:12 the house went silent, and then it spoke. Not in words, not in sound. In us. We turned to face each other simultaneously and whispered something neither of us remembered saying. The footage cut out, every device powered off at once. We woke up on the floor the next morning. No memory, no bruises, just a single message scrawled in ash on the wall above our bed. You watch me now. That was weeks ago. We're still here. We don't try to leave anymore. Not because we're afraid, but because the house doesn't let us sleep unless it knows we're still watching. And when we don't, the scratching starts again. The eyes return. The shape moves behind the walls. Now each night we take turns staying awake. We stare into the corners. We don't speak. We don't blink. And sometimes just before sunrise, I catch a glimpse of our reflection in the window. And we're still staring. But our eyes are no longer ours. They're the house's. Motherhood changes the way you sleep. It's not just that you get less of it. It's that even when you do sleep, it's never deep. Your brain rewires itself to listen, to monitor every creak of the house, every breath from the crib, every imagined threat in the night. The silence becomes louder, the darkness heavier. When our son was born, I knew I'd never sleep the same again. We bought a baby monitor, the kind with the audio and temperature readings, not the full video setup. I didn't want a screen glowing at all hours. Just the sound was enough. A soft, static comfort that told me he was still there, still breathing, still okay. The first few weeks were uneventful. He was a good sleeper, better than I expected. Most nights I'd wake only once to feed him. I'd turn up the monitor's volume before I drifted back to bed, letting the low hum soothe me like ocean waves on an empty shore. Then, one night, I heard something different. It was around 2:17 a.m. I remember because I looked at the clock, groggy and annoyed, already reaching for my robe to check on him. But the crying I expected never came. The monitor was on, the light glowing softly, but there were no baby sounds. Just static. And then, faint like a breeze brushing against the speaker, I heard a voice, a whisper. Not words at first, just a sound, like someone exhaling slowly into the mic. I froze, then clearer. A single word. My name, whispered so softly it almost didn't register. I sat upright, heart racing. I turned the volume all the way up. Silence. Then, from the crib, his usual soft breathing. Steady, peaceful. I walked into his room anyway. My legs felt heavier than they should have. The hallway stretched too long in the dark. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see something I couldn't explain. But it was just him. Asleep. Still. Arms above his head like he always did, his little chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. I stood there for a minute staring at him, then checked under the crib, the closet, behind the curtains. Nothing. I told myself it was a fluke, a trick of the static, a stray signal, maybe even a dream that had bled into waking. But the next night, it happened again, this time at 2:12 a.m. And again the whisper, Emily, not angry, not pleading, just close, like someone was standing inches from the microphone waiting. After the second night, I started keeping a notebook beside the bed. I wrote down the times, what I heard, how long it lasted. It felt like something a rational person would do. Something to keep me tethered to the idea that maybe it was just exhaustion, stress, or postpartum anxiety. A place to remind myself, this isn't real. But the notebook didn't help, because the pattern became undeniable. Every night. Around 2:10 to 2:20 a.m., the static would change. Shift. The sound would thin out, like it was making room for something else. And then, soft and deliberate, the whisper would come. Always the same voice. always the same word, Emily. Not shouted, not panicked, inviting, intimate, like a name whispered in the dark by someone who used to know me. The third night, I tried not to move. I lay completely still, listening, eyes fixed on the monitor. When the whisper came, I whispered back, "Who's there?" No answer. Just static. And then a soft click. The monitor cut out, not turned off, just went dead silent for 5 full seconds. When the sound returned, it wasn't the same. There was breathing. Shallow, close to the mic, but not a baby's breathing. It was too slow, too heavy, like an adult sitting close and waiting. Then I heard a faint rustling, like movement, in the crib. I ran to his room, heart hammering. When I burst through the door, the monitor still in hand, the silence hit me like a wall. My son was still asleep, curled slightly now, thumb near his mouth. But something was different. A stuffed toy we kept on the shelf, one I hadn't touched in days, was now tucked neatly beside him in the crib. A faded rabbit with one glass eye missing. I didn't remember putting it there. Neither did my husband. He thought I was overreacting. Static interference, he said. Signals cross, that happens all the time. He offered to switch out the monitor for another model, something digital, something newer. But the voice didn't care about the brand. It came through anyway. Night after night, clearer each time. By the 5th night, it said more than my name. "Emily, don't worry, he's safe with me, just like before." I couldn't breathe when I heard that. Just like before. Before what? There was no before. This was our first child, our first home. There had never been anything else. Right? That night I stayed in his room, sat in the rocking chair, monitor in hand, lights low, waiting. At 2:14 a.m. the whisper returned, but it wasn't through the monitor this time. It came from within the room. A voice so faint I felt it more than I heard it. It said, "You came back." I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not the whispers, not the movement, not the subtle rearrangements in my son's room, the toys that ended up in strange places, the books open to unfamiliar pages, the faint smell of smoke that lingered near the closet even though nothing had burned. And not the voice. Especially not the voice. I started digging through old emails, family documents, even property records. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew something didn't fit. That feeling of déjà vu had grown into something deeper, something colder. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning out a box in the storage room, I found a photo album tucked between baby blankets and picture frames. Inside were faded Polaroids from years ago, far before my marriage, before our child, before this house was ever ours, and in one of them, I was there. Standing in front of this very house, no more than 4 years old, holding a stuffed rabbit with one glass eye. The same one I'd found in the crib last week. I dropped the album. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I tried to remember, tried to reach back through time for any fragment that would make it make sense. But all I felt was absence, a blank space where something important had been erased. I called my mother. At first she denied it, said I was imagining things, that she'd never lived in this neighborhood, that I'd never been to this town before. But when I pressed her, when I told her about the house, the room, the toy, her voice changed. "I didn't want you to remember," she whispered. "You were too young." "Remember what?" I asked. She didn't answer, just said, "Leave the house, Emily, please. Take the baby and go." Then she hung up. That night I didn't sleep. I watched the monitor for hours, waiting, daring it to speak again. At 2:13 a.m. the static changed. The screen flickered. Then the voice came back. "I remember you. You were so small. You cried for hours, but I kept you warm. Your mother left you with me. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear the monitor from the wall and smash it against the floor. But I couldn't move, because my son started to stir, not in fear, not in discomfort, but like he was reaching for something. His tiny hand lifted, fingers stretching toward the far side of the crib, and from the monitor I heard a second voice, high-pitched, childlike, echoing through the static. "Mama." I froze. He doesn't speak yet. He's barely 9 months old, but the voice called again. And this time it didn't sound like him. It sounded like another child, one I had forgotten, or maybe one I had left behind. The house felt colder after that night, not in temperature, in presence. The walls seemed to press inward. The floors creaked more. The lights flickered even when the power was stable. My son, at least the child in the crib, still ate, slept, cried, giggled, but I'd stopped calling him by name. Because every time I looked at him too long, I felt it again. That flicker of doubt, of something not quite right, something beneath the surface of his gaze, a pause too long before he responded. A smile that came too easily, like it was being rehearsed, and the monitor kept whispering, every night. He's been so patient. He waited for you, Emily. You promised you wouldn't leave again. I played back one of the recordings for my husband. He heard only static. But when I played it again alone, the voice was there. Clearer than ever. It didn't just say my name anymore. It said things only I could know. Childhood memories I hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Names of imaginary friends. A lullaby my mother used to hum before she stopped singing altogether. I began to wonder, was it really a haunting or a reunion? The dreams changed. I no longer dreamed of my son's room or the monitor or the voice. I dreamed of fire, of a crib burning, and a child screaming from behind a locked door. And in the dream, I wasn't rushing in to save him. I was outside, running away. And waking up with the smell of smoke on my skin. One morning, I found a second monitor, old, dusty, hidden at the back of the bedroom closet. It was the exact same model, only this one had no batteries. And when I turned it over, there was a name carved into the plastic backing in jagged, childish handwriting, Daniel. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't know why, until I remembered. It wasn't a memory, it was a feeling, a terrible, choking kind of sadness. A name once whispered to me in the dark by someone who had no voice left. A name I had buried deep beneath years of silence. Daniel, my brother, or my son? No, it wasn't possible. Unless, that night I heard crying again, louder than ever. I ran into the nursery, heart pounding, expecting to see my son in distress. But the crib was empty. The room was cold, and in the center of the floor sat the stuffed rabbit with the missing eye. I turned around, ready to scream, and found myself face to face with a child, but not mine. Pale, still, eyes far older than they should be. He looked at me and whispered, almost sadly, I came back, like you said. The next morning, no one believed what I said. The police found no signs of forced entry. My husband said I was under too much stress. But that night, the monitor turned on again. And this time, it didn't call for Emily. It whispered a different name. Mama. There was nothing extraordinary about the night it began. The rain had started just after midnight, light at first, then gradually harder, drumming against the window panes like fingers impatiently tapping to be let in. I had been working late, as usual, lost in spreadsheets and half-drunk coffee. My apartment, tucked away on the 5th floor of a modest brick building, was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic patter of rain. I didn't believe in anything beyond the explainable. Life to me was numbers, routine, logic. Ghosts belonged in horror films, not in the world of tax forms and project deadlines. That's why the sound of my phone vibrating on the counter didn't stir any sense of dread at first. I glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. No name, no number, just unknown caller. It was probably spam, I told myself. A late-night robocall, maybe. But something about the timing, the precise stillness of that hour, compelled me to answer. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. What I heard wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a greeting. It was a memory. Spoken softly, almost reverently, like someone turning the pages of a diary they had no right to read. It described a summer day, long ago. A dusty backyard, the smell of chalk and warm plastic toys. I had built a makeshift fort with my grandmother's old bedsheets, used sticks from the maple tree to hold it together. The memory was vivid, detailed, but private, sacred. There were things even my parents didn't know, like the tin box I'd buried behind the swing set, or the name I'd scrawled on the fabric wall of my fort, a name that meant something only to my grandmother and me. And this voice, low, rasping, genderless, recited it all, word for word. I stood frozen in my kitchen, heart thudding in my chest. The air felt heavier somehow, like the pressure had shifted. I tried to make sense of it. Had someone been spying on me? Was this an elaborate prank? But how could anyone possibly know this? The memory had no photos, no witnesses, just two people, and the other had been dead for over 20 years. I didn't say anything. I just listened, unable to move. After a few seconds, the line went dead. No click, no goodbye, just silence. My screen returned to black as if nothing had happened. But something had. The chill didn't leave the room for hours. The memory, once so warm and tucked away, now felt exposed, violated. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of confusion. I told myself it was a dream, maybe even a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down I already knew the truth. I hadn't misheard anything. Someone, or something, had reached through the veil of ordinary life and whispered my past back to me. And it wasn't finished. Morning came like a pale apology. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt damp and heavy. I sat on the edge of my bed, barely rested, staring at the phone I'd left charging overnight. I hoped I'd see something, a call log, a missed number, anything. But there was nothing. The call had left no trace, as if it never existed. Still clinging to the idea that there had to be a rational explanation, I started checking everything. The call history, the voicemail, the network settings, but all came up empty. I even searched for apps that might mimic prank calls, thinking maybe someone with access to my phone had installed something without me noticing. Nothing. I called my brother that afternoon. We hadn't talked much in recent years, but I figured if anyone had access to our old memories, it might be him. When I mentioned the fort in Grandma's backyard, he chuckled vaguely, remembering the bedsheets and the tree, but not the details, not the tin box, not the name I'd written, not the words the voice had repeated. Then I asked him about the phone call, whether he'd received anything strange recently. He hadn't. No anonymous calls, no whispers from the past, just the usual emails and work stress. That night, I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a hyper-real dream brought on by fatigue. My mind had always had a way of clinging to detail. It was possible, I reasoned, that I'd remembered something in a half-asleep state and imagined hearing it aloud. But denial has a short shelf life when the unexplainable returns. It was 1:43 a.m. when the phone buzzed again. Same thing, unknown caller. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the screen in my hand. A part of me wanted to let it ring, to pretend it wasn't real. But I answered. This time the voice didn't waste time. It dove straight into another memory. One I hadn't thought about in decades. I was 5. It was fall. Leaves had begun to curl and crunch underfoot in the yard behind my childhood home. I had found a dead bird, small, fragile, lying under the porch steps. I hadn't known what to do, so I buried it in a shoebox. But before I covered it with dirt, I'd whispered something into the box. A childish prayer, a secret, one I'd never repeated. And the voice recited it, word for word. My knees went weak. I dropped to the floor, pressing my back against the cold kitchen cabinet. That small, innocent moment, forgotten by everyone, even me, had been dredged up with such clarity it felt like the present was folding in on itself. Whoever or whatever this caller was, they weren't just watching me now. They had been watching for a long time. That was the moment fear took root. Not just fear of the unknown, but fear of being known too deeply, too completely. There are things in each of us we believe are ours alone. Memories sealed in the vaults of childhood, kept safe by time and the quiet death of those who shared them. But now, something had pried open that vault and was reading from the pages like it had written them. And I was beginning to suspect it had. After the second call, I stopped pretending I had control over my own thoughts. Something had reached into the core of me, found the dust-covered memories I didn't even realize still existed, and brought them to the surface. But it wasn't just the resurfacing of old emotions that unnerved me. It was the precision. The surgical way the voice recounted those private moments, always without hesitation, without error. As if it had been there with me all along. I began to notice changes in my daily routine. Small things at first. The ceiling fan in my bedroom would sometimes be on when I hadn't touched the switch. The hallway light flickered briefly around midnight each night, always at the same time. My cat, normally indifferent to anything except food, started staring at the corner of the living room as if something stood there, watching. I became hyper-aware of silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the apartment structure felt louder, more deliberate. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now seemed too thin. The space too open. The shadows, once ignored, started to resemble silhouettes. I couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time. My mind refused to settle. I stopped answering regular calls. I turned off notifications, covered mirrors, unplugged everything I could. But none of it made me feel safer. I even tried leaving the apartment one night, staying in a cheap hotel downtown. But even there, at precisely 2:06 a.m., my phone vibrated on the nightstand. No number, no name. The call lasted only 10 seconds. No words this time, only breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate, like something ancient mimicking the sound of being alive. The sound lingered in my ears long after the call ended. And with it came the certainty I was being followed. Not physically. No footsteps, no figures in alleys, no strange cars parked across the street. Spirit, intellectually, psychologically. Something had attached itself to me, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I tried searching online. I browsed through forums about supernatural experiences, read stories from people who'd claimed to receive messages from the dead, warnings from beyond. Some felt similar, vague hints of familiarity, unexplained knowledge, but nothing matched the sheer intimacy of what I was experiencing. I began to doubt everything. My sanity, my memory, my very sense of self. Could I have recorded these childhood moments somehow and forgotten? Had I told someone in passing? Written them down? But the truth was, I knew better. These were not things I had shared. These were fragments buried so deep they felt fossilized. One night, I found myself staring at a photograph of my grandmother. It was faded, the colors dulled by time. Her smile was soft, kind, but there was a depth in her eyes that unsettled me now. As if she had known something back then, something I hadn't. That night I dreamed of the backyard again, the fort, the whisper in the box. But in the dream, someone else was watching from the edge of the trees. I couldn't see a face, only the outline of something impossibly still. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing, breath shallow, and the phone was ringing again. The call ended before I could answer. This time, there were no words, no breathing, just a static hum that grew louder the longer I stared at the screen. It didn't stop until I set the phone down, and when I picked it back up, the call had vanished without a trace, like the others. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was weighty, almost reverent, as if something was waiting. That morning I stood at my kitchen window for hours, watching the world move on as if nothing had changed. People walked their dogs, a delivery truck backed into the alley. Someone watered their plants on a neighboring balcony. Life continued. Unknowing, untouched, but inside me something had shifted permanently. I couldn't stop thinking about the last thing the voice had said on the second call, about a promise I made when I was 7. At first, it hadn't registered. Childhood is full of imagined vows, forgotten declarations. But the more I searched my memory, the more a particular moment began to take shape. I had been sitting beside my grandmother's bed in the final weeks of her life. The air in her room had smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She'd asked me to take care of something, a tiny, fragile thing I had long since buried in memory. A storybook, one with worn pages and a cracked spine. It was her favorite to read to me, and I had promised to keep it safe. And when she was gone, I had hidden it in the attic, beneath a floorboard. But I had forgotten. In the years that followed, the house was sold, renovated, the attic likely gutted, that part of our lives gone with it. The weight of that forgotten promise pressed down on me like wet earth. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper. A recognition that perhaps the calls weren't warnings or hauntings, but reminders. Something or someone was holding me accountable for what I had left behind. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That afternoon, I drove for 6 hours without stopping. The old house still stood, albeit with a new coat of paint and unfamiliar curtains in the windows. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't even get out of the car. I just sat there, staring at it from across the street, letting memories rise and break against me like waves. The backyard was overgrown, the swing set long gone, but the tree still stood, older, gnarled oak, but unchanged in its quiet authority. Just before I left, I noticed something strange. On the curb beside the mailbox sat an old box of junk, things the new owners had probably cleared from the attic or garage. Among the broken tools and faded holiday decorations was a tattered book. Its cover was peeling. The title was nearly gone. But I knew it. My chest tightened as I stepped out, reached for it with trembling hands. I opened to the first page. Inside, in shaky crayon handwriting, were the words, "I promise to keep this safe for you forever," signed with my childhood scrawl. That night, back in my apartment, I placed the book gently on the nightstand. I turned off all the lights, sat in the dark. The phone rang at exactly 2 a.m. I didn't check the screen. I didn't speak. I just picked it up, pressed it to my ear, and whispered, "I'm sorry." There was no reply, only the soft sound of wind through trees, and then the line went quiet. It hasn't rung since, but sometimes, late at night, I still wake up to the faint scent of lavender. For over 30 years, Walter had kept watch over the dead. The cemetery lay on the edge of a quiet village, nestled between a narrow strip of woods and a crumbling stone wall built generations ago. It wasn't large. Maybe 100 graves scattered across mossy hills, most of them worn and crooked with age. Some headstones had cracked beyond recognition. Others leaned forward as if trying to whisper secrets to the earth. The only constant presence among them was Walter, hunched, quiet, methodical. The kind of man who remembered every name, every flower left, every odd thing he ever saw but never spoke of. Each morning, Walter followed the same routine. He rose before dawn, made black coffee on his rusted stove, and walked the same path through the cemetery with a worn notebook in one hand and a small rake in the other. He cleaned up leaves, trimmed overgrown weeds, straightened flowers blown over in the night. He wrote notes in tidy handwriting. Stone number 14, chip on left corner. Section C, rabbit burrow near fence. That's how he noticed it. It was early October. The trees had begun to shed, and frost made the grass crunch beneath his boots. He was halfway through his morning rounds when he stopped cold. Something was off. Subtle, but wrong. It was Grave 73, a modest headstone of pale granite, worn smooth by rain and time. The name on it was barely visible now, but Walter remembered it well. He had written it into his logbook almost 8 years ago. But the grave wasn't where it was supposed to be. It had moved. Not just a few inches, 3, maybe 4 meters to the west. It now sat awkwardly closer to the old chestnut tree, where no graves had ever been plotted. The ground beneath it was undisturbed, no shovel marks, no collapsed earth. No sign of dragging. The grass looked intact, soft and frost-tipped like all the others. If someone had moved the entire plot overnight, they had done so with impossible care. Walter stared for several minutes, blinking at the strange sight. He flipped through his logbook, found the old sketch he'd made of the grave's original placement. It was unmistakable. The grave had shifted. He even had photographs from last season to prove it. In them, grave number 73 clearly sat beside a small sloped patch of stones, a good distance from where it now stood. There had been no storms, no flooding, nothing that could have caused a landslide or upheaval. And even if there had been, the surrounding graves were untouched, still precisely where they'd always been. Walter knelt beside the headstone, running a gloved hand over its base. It felt solid, firmly rooted, not recently touched, as if the earth had always held it in this new spot. But Walter knew that wasn't true. That evening, he went through the old records, burial certificates, topographic maps, his personal logs. All pointed to the same quiet, unsettling conclusion. The grave had been relocated without any human effort. That night, for the first time in years, Walter locked the door to his small house by the gate, not out of fear exactly, but out of instinct. Something ancient and quiet had stirred beneath the soil, and it had begun to move. Walter didn't sleep well after discovering the grave's displacement. His dreams were shallow and fragmented, filled with the rustling of leaves and the creak of wood under pressure, sounds that didn't belong in the world of sleep. He woke often, checking the time, listening for movement outside. But the night passed without incident. And in the grey light of early morning, he resumed his routine with unease pressing gently against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The grave hadn't moved again. Grave number 73 remained near the chestnut tree, unchanged from the day before. But Walter didn't feel relief. Instead, the stillness felt more deliberate, as if whatever force had shifted the grave was watching, waiting for a reason to act again. He walked the perimeter of the cemetery slowly, pausing at intervals, scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. But the grass was undisturbed, the soil compact and frozen. No footprints, no tire marks, no broken branches or moved stones. It was as though the earth itself had rearranged. By mid-morning, he found himself in the small cemetery office, a one-room structure that had once been a tool shed. Folders were stacked in neat rows on wooden shelves, each labelled with plot numbers and names. He found the file for grave number 73. Name Anna M. Rilke. Date of death March 2nd, 1995. The file was thin, too thin. No burial permit, no family contact, just a scanned copy of a death certificate and a single note in handwriting not his own. Transferred from city lot, no kin claimed. Transferred. That word struck him oddly. Most graves came with history, paperwork, relatives, grief. But this one had appeared quietly during a wet spring nearly a decade ago. He remembered the day, now that he focused on it. A hearse arrived at dawn, with a coffin already sealed. The driver handed him a note, unsigned, and left before Walter could ask any questions. The headstone had arrived weeks later, delivered by a local stonemason who said he'd been paid in cash. He never questioned it at the time. Not really. Some lives end quietly. But now the silence around that death felt unnatural. The following night, something changed. Around 2:30 a.m., Walter stirred from shallow sleep. There was a noise outside, faint like cloth brushing over dry leaves. He sat up, heart thudding. He told himself it was just wind, but the air was still. Unable to ignore the pull, he pulled on his coat, grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The cemetery lay silent, veiled in thin fog. He made his way carefully toward grave number 73. As he approached, he noticed something strange. A line of withered grass, faint but visible, stretched from the grave's original location to where it now stood, like a scar across the ground. At first glance, it seemed natural, like an animal trail. But the shape was too straight, too narrow, as if the grave had been pulled. The beam of his flashlight caught something just beyond the grave, small indentations in the soil. They weren't footprints. Not quite. They resembled handprints, spaced apart, claw-like impressions barely pressed into the surface, fading into the fog. Walter stared for a long time before turning back. The next morning he returned to find the marks gone. The grass looked undisturbed, no line, no handprints, but the sense of presence lingered. Something was beneath that grave, and it wasn't done moving yet. Walter was not a man easily shaken. But over the next several days, the silence of the cemetery became unbearable. Not because of noise, but because of the overwhelming absence of it. Even birds, which usually fluttered through the trees in early morning, seemed to avoid the grounds now. The wind, once a constant presence, had grown still. Time itself felt slower, and yet the grave had stopped moving. For now. Walter returned to the office, determined to find the missing pieces. The folder for Anna M. Rilke had been suspiciously thin. Too little documentation, no family records, no obituary. Even the death certificate looked like a low-resolution photocopy, the kind passed around unofficially, not filed through proper channels. He searched the oldest cabinet in the back of the office, one rarely touched since the day he arrived. Inside were burial logs handwritten by his predecessor, a man named Harold, who had worked the cemetery alone for nearly 50 years before passing away in the small house beside the gate. Harold had been methodical, even obsessive, with record-keeping. Walter trusted his notes more than any official form. He found the entry for the day the coffin arrived. March 12, 2016. Next to the plot number, Harold had written, "Burial expedited, Woman, no ID, temporary paperwork only. No family present. Transported by order of local hospital morgue. Unusual condition of body. No embalming. No facial documentation. Walter blinked. Unusual condition of body. He had been there that day. He remembered rain, mud, a driver who said little, but he didn't remember seeing the casket open. He assumed the burial was standard procedure, like so many others. He flipped to the next page. A note had been added in red ink dated 3 days later. Headstone installed without order. No billing on file. No engraving request submitted. So someone had placed the stone without authorization, and no one had been charged for it. Walter sat back in the creaking wooden chair, cold creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the grave that was out of place. The entire existence of the person beneath it was foggy, untraceable. A burial without witnesses, a marker without commission, a body buried without proper preparation. He left the office and walked out into the cold afternoon air, heading back to grave 73. The fog had returned again, thin and low, barely skimming the grass. The trees rustled above, and a bitter smell clung faintly to the wind, like iron and damp leaves. He stared at the grave for a long while, as if it might explain itself. Then he noticed something he hadn't before. Beneath the engraving on the stone, below the name, faint letters had begun to appear. Hairline cracks in the granite, shaped unnaturally into form. They hadn't been there a week ago. But now they were unmistakable. I did not belong here. The inscription had not been carved. It surfaced, as though pushed upward from within the stone itself. Walter stepped back, breath catching in his throat. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the old armchair by the window, oil lamp lit, staring out at the graveyard wrapped in fog. Something had moved the grave, but something inside the grave had left a message. By the fourth night, Walter had stopped pretending this was just a mystery to be solved. He didn't contact the church. He didn't call the town records office. He didn't tell anyone in the village. Some truths he'd begun to understand weren't meant to be processed through paper and ink. Some belonged to the earth and to the things that moved beneath it when no one was looking. The fog had thickened by dusk. It hung low, not natural mist, but something more. Something with weight, with purpose. The cemetery looked different through it, as though Walter had stepped into a mirror world, familiar yet skewed. The air pressed against his skin with invisible fingers, damp and cold and knowing. He lit the oil lamp in his window and sat by it, watching. It was nearly 3 in the morning, when the silence broke. The sound was soft at first, like shifting gravel, but with a rhythm, like dragging. Walter rose slowly, heart steady, not with courage but with resignation. Whatever had come here, whatever had moved that grave, had not come to frighten him. It had come to finish something. He stepped outside into the mist. The lamp's glow illuminated only a few feet ahead, but it was enough. Through the fog, the gravestones stood like teeth in the earth. Still, watching, waiting, and then he saw it. Grave No. 73 was no longer by the chestnut tree. It had moved again. Now it stood at the very edge of the cemetery, near the tree line, just before the old forest began. A place no graves had ever touched. A space left open since the cemetery's founding, as if even the planners had sensed something sacred or forbidden there. The grass around it had withered to black. The soil beneath it looked freshly packed, not from a shovel but from something older, something that had risen and sunk again. Walter approached, the lamp flickering in his grip. The headstone looked the same, but the faint words at the bottom, the ones that had surfaced days before, had changed. Now it read, "I am home." He didn't move for a long time. He didn't try to record it, didn't take photos, didn't mark its new location in his book. He simply stood there, breathing in the cold, metallic air, understanding without understanding. Something had been buried in the wrong place. Not by accident, not by malice, just by the careless hand of bureaucracy, of unknowing men who never stopped to ask if the dead could still long for peace. That morning, Walter left a single white flower at the foot of the grave. He didn't tend the cemetery for the next 3 days. When he returned, grave No. 73 had not moved. The grass around it had begun to regrow, slow, pale green shoots like veins through the frost. The fog never came back after that. The wind returned to the trees. The birds sang again. Whatever had sought a resting place had found it. And Walter, who had spent his life tending the forgotten, now understood what it meant to be remembered, even by the dead. We used to think we were invincible. It was the kind of friendship that made you believe nothing could ever go wrong. 4 of us, me, Liam, Josh and Devin, bound by a childhood spent in the same cul-de-sac, the same classrooms, the same dumb dares that only boys growing up in quiet towns come up with. Every summer, we pushed the line a little further, climbing abandoned water towers, breaking into shuttered buildings, recording videos in supposedly haunted places. It became a tradition, one that followed us well into our 20s. So when Liam suggested the tunnel, none of us said no. It was near the edge of a mountain town we'd rented a cabin in, something rustic, remote, buried in pine trees and morning fog. The kind of place where the air was too clean and the roads too quiet. We weren't there for peace. We were chasing the thrill. Locals called it the Dead Tunnel, a name spoken more with tired caution than drama. They said it used to be part of an old freight railway line, shut down after a derailment in the 1970s. Officially, the accident was blamed on brake failure. Unofficially, no one wanted to talk about it. Several people had died. Their bodies were never recovered. Eventually, the tunnel was sealed off, or at least meant to be. We found the entrance easily enough. The path was overgrown, but not hidden. The mouth of the tunnel yawned open in the hillside like something waiting to breathe. Graffiti littered the stone walls, half covered by moss. The rusted gate had long since collapsed. It was Liam's idea to film it. He wanted something new for his growing audience, a solo walk through the entire tunnel. No edits, no cuts. Raw fear, he called it. Josh and Devin laughed as they always did, treating the danger like fiction. And I didn't speak up. I never did. Not when Liam had that look in his eye, the one that said he'd already made up his mind. We agreed on a plan. Liam would walk ahead with his camera, narrating as he went. The tunnel, according to maps, curved slightly but was relatively straight for the first few 100 meters. We'd follow behind after a minute or two, giving him space to film. The air changed the moment we stepped inside. The warmth of the sun vanished behind us, replaced by a thick, stagnant chill. Our footsteps echoed in unnatural patterns, as if the sound was bouncing off walls that didn't match the shape of the tunnel. Dust floated in the beam of our flashlights like ash. Liam's voice grew fainter. The deeper he went, then we heard it stop. There was no scream, no crash, no warning. One moment he was ahead of us, a flicker of light just around the bend. The next, nothing. We called out. Nothing answered. We ran forward, flashlights trembling. All we found was his phone lying face up on the ground. The screen was still recording. The last frame caught something we would never forget. A blurred silhouette in the darkness. Tall, impossibly thin, standing just behind Liam as he turned. Then the feed cut out, and Liam was gone. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered across the ground, its beam rolling over the damp stone walls in dizzying arcs. Devin picked it up, but none of us said a word. We just stared at the spot where Liam's phone had landed, its screen now black, though still warm from recording. We called his name, once, then again, louder. The sound echoed endlessly, swallowed by the tunnel's curve, until it no longer sounded like our voices. We ran forward, deeper into the dark, hearts pounding, the air growing colder with every step. But there was no sign of him, no footprints on the dusty floor, no dropped equipment, no voice calling back. We rewound the footage in the phone, hands trembling, crouched beneath the flickering light of our flashlights. The video lasted exactly 37 seconds. Liam had walked slowly, panning the camera to show the graffiti, narrating in his usual sarcastic tone. The tunnel was darker than it should have been, even with the light. Shadows stretched unnaturally long behind him. At second 32, the camera began to shake. Liam had stopped walking. His breath grew louder, more shallow. He turned slightly, pointing the camera behind him, and that's when we saw it. A shape barely visible, not quite human, not quite shadow, just wrong, towering, blurry, standing motionless a few steps behind. Then came the sound. Not a scream, not words, something deeper, like a breath inhaled through old lungs, followed by static. The camera fell. And that was it. We turned back. Fast. Running with the kind of panic that hits when instinct takes over, when logic no longer applies. Outside the tunnel, the air felt poisonous. Heavy. We didn't speak on the way back to the cabin. We didn't have to. Each of us was lost in a private storm of questions we didn't want to answer. The police arrived that evening. We gave them everything, the phone, the footage, the story. We expected disbelief. Instead, they were quiet, professional, detached, as if they'd heard something like this before. The search began before dawn. A full team with dogs, drones, spotlights. They sealed the tunnel entrance after 2 days. They found nothing. No footprints beyond where we had stopped. No scent trail. No signs of collapse or hidden passages. No Liam. It was as if he had stepped into the air itself and dissolved. His parents came. They asked the same questions we had no answers for. Eventually they took his things and left, eyes hollow, shoulders broken by the weight of not knowing. For weeks after, I replayed the footage over and over, frame by frame. I analysed the shadows, studied the sounds, looked for tricks of the light, signs of tampering, explanations rooted in reason. But none came. The thing in the video, it didn't belong in any logical world. It didn't move like a person. It didn't look like one. Devon stopped speaking to us. Josh moved to another state. The group, once so tightly bound, unraveled without Liam at its centre. And me? I kept dreaming of the tunnel, of the moment he disappeared, and of the shape that stood behind him, still waiting. The nightmares began on the 11th night. At first, they were fragmented, shadows curling at the edges of dreams, distant echoes of footsteps in dark corridors, but they grew sharper, more vivid. I'd wake up gasping, heart racing, convinced I could still feel the tunnel's cold air pressing against my skin. Each time I saw Liam, standing far ahead, his back to me, and something tall behind him. Motionless, watching. I stopped sleeping through the night. My appetite vanished. My phone would light up with phantom notifications at odd hours, only to show nothing. The worst part, though, was the silence, the kind that creeps into your bones. My apartment, once a quiet refuge, now felt alive with something unseen. Corners darkened too early. My reflection in the mirror sometimes lingered a second too long. Then it happened. It was 3:14 a.m. when my phone buzzed. I hadn't heard that ringtone in weeks. It was the custom tone I'd assigned to Liam. My chest tightened. I reached for the phone, fingers shaking. One new message from Liam's number. No text, just an image. I tapped it open. The photo was grainy, low resolution, almost black. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed a faint outline, the curve of the tunnel walls, barely visible, buried in shadows. But there, near the center, was a shape. Human. Facing the camera. And just behind it, a face. Pale. Elongated. Eyes like pits. I dropped the phone. That same morning, I drove 3 hours back to the mountain town. The sky was overcast, and the wind howled through the narrow roads as I approached the old trail. The authorities had installed a chain-link fence across the tunnel's mouth. A sign warned trespassers of danger and legal consequences. But the lock had already been cut. The chain hung loose, swaying slightly. Someone had returned before me. I stepped through. The air inside was just as I remembered, still, suffocating, colder than it had any right to be. But this time, I came prepared. A high-powered flashlight, fresh batteries, and an audio recorder clipped to my jacket. I walked carefully, retracing our original steps. Past the graffiti, past the place where we'd found the phone, past the bend where Liam had disappeared. Nothing. Until the flashlight flickered, just once. Then the recorder let out a sharp hiss and began to play something. Not static, not malfunction. A voice, faint, familiar. It whispered, "Still here." I froze. The voice was his, Liam's. It wasn't a recording from the video, it was new, broken, distant, but undeniably his. I turned around and ran, Faster than I ever had before, my lungs burned, my throat ached from breathing cold air too quickly. I didn't stop until I saw daylight bleeding through the entrance of the tunnel. I stumbled out into the trees and collapsed. The recorder played silence after that. No voice, no sound, like it had never happened. But I knew it had. Liam was still in there, somewhere in the dark, and something was keeping him from leaving. After that night, I stopped talking about it. People had already started to look at me differently. Friends, co-workers, even family spoke with gentle tones and cautious glances, the kind reserved for someone they believed was slowly coming undone. I didn't blame them. How could I expect anyone to believe that a missing man had whispered to me through a recorder inside a tunnel that no longer made sense? But I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with the tunnel's history. I dug into newspaper archives, hunted down local records, even drove hours to dusty libraries and dead-end municipal buildings. And finally I found something, a faded article clipped from a 1974 regional journal. A train derailment, 32, presumed dead. A list of names, but no follow-up, no funerals, no public outcry. Buried news, intentionally. One detail stood out, a line at the bottom, barely legible. Rescue efforts abandoned after third day. Survivors reported voices calling from deep within the tunnel. None recovered. I stared at that sentence until the ink blurred. The tunnel hadn't just taken lives, it had kept them. I returned one final time. This time, I didn't bring tools or technology. No flashlight, no recorder, just a single candle and the small leather-bound journal I'd started after Liam vanished, filled with notes, sketches, color, fragmented dreams. I wanted it with me. Not to document what I found, but in case I didn't come back. The tunnel was quieter than ever. Sound died quickly inside. The air was heavier, like it was full of invisible water. I lit the candle and stepped deeper than I'd ever gone before. Beyond the curve, past where Liam had disappeared, past where even the rescue teams had stopped looking. The walls seemed to change the further in I went. The stone became smoother, less carved by man and more grown, like the tunnel had been shaped by something older than railways or tools. Markings appeared, long, shallow scratches, like symbols or warnings etched by hands desperate to leave something behind. I stopped when I saw the footprints. Not mine, not new. Faint depressions in the dust, spaced irregularly, leading forward, leading deeper. I followed them. And then, just at the edge of the candlelight, I saw him, or what looked like him, standing in the dark, still, silent. His clothes were the same, his posture, but something was off. His skin, too pale, his eyes too wide. He didn't move, didn't speak. Behind him the dark thickened, shifted. Something breathed. And in that moment I understood. He wasn't trapped. He had become part of it. A piece of whatever haunted that place. Whatever fed on memory, fear and time. Whatever needed more. I didn't run. I simply turned around, step by step, and walked back toward the mouth of the tunnel. Candle flickered wildly, as if resisting. I didn't look back. The light of morning broke across the trees when I emerged. I collapsed at the edge of the woods, staring up at the sky like I was seeing it for the first time. That was 6 months ago. They found my journal outside the tunnel 2 weeks later, torn, damp, but one page remained intact. It read, "If you hear your name in the dark, don't answer." It was the first storm of the season, the kind that crept in slow and quiet, like it was holding its breath until nightfall. The sky had darkened by late afternoon, and by dinner time, the rain was coming down in sheets. I was 10 years old, and my mother and I lived in a weathered apartment building on the edge of a small coastal town, 3 stories tall and built in the 1970s. Our unit was on the top floor, facing the ocean. That meant the view was nice on clear days. It also meant we got the full force of every storm that rolled in from the sea. That night, the wind howled like a living thing. The kind of wind that seemed to rattle your bones, not just your windows. Thunder cracked loud enough to shake picture frames, and the lights blinked twice before giving up altogether. Mom lit candles around the apartment, then went to bed early, wrapping herself in an extra blanket and mumbling something about the power company. But I couldn't sleep. I stood by the window in my room, watching the storm through the glass. There was something mesmerizing about it. The way the rain chased itself sideways across the balcony railing, the branches of the trees below whipping back and forth like frantic arms. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to see how far out the ocean waves reached, but all I could make out was the black blur of night and the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way shadows played on glass when lightning struck. But the next bolt came only seconds later, and in that burst of harsh blue-white light, it was unmistakable. There was a face, right there on the other side of the window, not pressed up against the glass, not floating, just there, suspended in the dark, staring in. The skin was pale, almost colorless, and the eyes were wide, too wide. They looked more like voids than eyes, not angry or sad, just present. Watching, I stumbled backward, heart leaping into my throat. Another flash came. The face was gone. The room was silent except for the storm. No creak of the balcony, no tap of footsteps, just the storm. I remember standing there frozen, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that my eyes had been tired, the lightning had bent shadows into something human. But deep inside, I knew better. There had been detail. That face wasn't a blur, it was sharp, defined, and it had been looking directly at me. Eventually, I crawled into bed without telling my mother. I pulled the blanket over my head and waited for the storm to end. But long after the thunder faded and the winds died, I kept my eyes closed, tightly, afraid that if I opened them, I might see that face again. I didn't tell anyone about the face. Not that night, not the next day, not even when my mother asked why I seemed jumpy or why I hadn't slept well. I didn't have the words to explain what I'd seen. And part of me hoped that staying silent would make it disappear, like a half-remembered dream that fades in the morning light. But it didn't fade. Over the next few weeks, the memory of that pale face stayed lodged in my mind, cold and heavy like a stone in my chest. And as the days passed and the weather turned colder, the storms came more often. Small ones at first, just a few hours of rain and wind. But then another big one rolled in, and that's when it returned. The second time I saw it, I was prepared, though I wish I hadn't been. It was a few minutes past midnight. The storm had arrived earlier that evening, tearing through the sky with a violence that shook the walls. My mother had already gone to bed, but I was still awake, lying in the dark, heart pounding as I stared at the closed curtains across the room. I hadn't looked out the window since that first night, but something about this storm felt the same. The pressure in the air, the flickering power, the way the wind carried a low moan, like something grieving in the distance. I sat up, feet touching the cool floor. My hands moved before I could stop them, drawing the curtain open just a crack. And there it was again. A bolt of lightning illuminated the glass, and the face stared back at me, unchanged. The same hollow expression, the same bottomless, the same unnatural stillness. But this time it was closer, almost touching the glass. I yanked the curtain closed and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of my bed. My breath was shallow, and I was shaking all over. But what scared me most wasn't the face itself. It was the realization that I had expected it to be there, like it was part of the storm now. The next morning I told myself, again, that it must have been in my head, some kind of vivid hallucination. But that excuse crumbled the moment I checked the glass. There was moisture on the outside of the window, sure, from the rain, but there was also something else. Smudges. 2 long, faint streaks right where a face might have leaned. And a circle, like a partial breath mark, as if someone or something had stood there, exhaling slowly onto the glass from the outside. We lived on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony beneath my window, no fire escape, nothing anyone could have stood on. I stared at those smudges until my mother called me for breakfast. I never mentioned them. After that, the storm started feeling personal. It wasn't just bad weather anymore, it was a pattern, a ritual. Each time the wind howled and the rain lashed against the building, I felt it watching, waiting. And I knew it would come back again. It was my mother who finally saw it next. Weeks had passed since the second sighting, and though I kept quiet, something in me had changed. I became quieter, more withdrawn. I avoided the window entirely, even during the day. I would sit at the edge of my bed with the curtains drawn tight, feeling like a prisoner in my own room. I didn't know how to ask for help, not without sounding unwell. But part of me longed for someone else to witness what I had, to prove that I wasn't slipping into some personal nightmare. And then, one night, the sky split open again. It was the fiercest storm yet. Rain struck the windows like thrown gravel. Thunder cracked in rolling waves, one after the other, like something massive pounding its way closer. My mother had been in the kitchen when the lights flickered and went out. I heard her sigh from across the apartment, then rummage for the emergency flashlight. When she came into my room to check on me, I was already curled under the blanket, wide-eyed, clutching my knees to my chest. She sat beside me, gently brushing the hair from my forehead. I wanted to tell her not to look out the window, that it was there, that it always came during storms like this. But I didn't say a word. She stood up and pulled the curtain aside. There was a pause, a beat of silence that stretched too long. Then lightning flashed, and she gasped. I sat up instantly. I saw it in her face, in the way she recoiled, in the way her hand dropped from the curtain. She didn't scream, she didn't speak. But something in her expression confirmed everything I had kept to myself for weeks. She had seen it too. But just like me, when she looked again, it was gone. The next morning, neither of us said anything about it. But something had changed. My mother began to ask quiet questions. She didn't mention what she saw directly, but she asked about strange sounds, about dreams, about whether I remembered anything unusual before we moved in. And I could tell she was researching something on her own. I saw old books on local history stacked on the kitchen table. Newspaper printouts, handwritten notes. Then one night, she came into my room and sat down without a word. Her face was pale, almost as pale as the one in the glass. She told me that our apartment hadn't always been a rental. It had once belonged to a woman who lived there with her son, a boy around my age. One night, during a storm, the boy had gotten locked out on the balcony while playing. His mother claimed he had knocked, even called her name through the glass. But by the time she opened the door, he was gone. No one saw him fall. But they found his body later, broken, at the base of the building. The reports called it an accident, but the mother swore she had seen his face in the window again, more than once, always during storms. I sat in silence, my breath shallow. It hadn't just started with me. That face had been appearing for years, watching, waiting, trapped. The story of the boy haunted me. After my mother told me what she had found, a silence settled between us. Not the kind born of fear, but of helplessness. The recognition that something beyond understanding had taken root in our lives, and we were only now beginning to grasp its shape. We planned to move, quietly, without urgency, as if leaving in haste might stir the thing more. My mother called relatives in another town, made vague excuses to the landlord, packed boxes in slow motion. But storms have a way of choosing their own time. 3 nights before we were supposed to leave, the final storm came. It didn't start gradually like the others. It exploded into being. A wall of rain, a sky streaked with jagged light, wind howling so violently that it shook the building's frame. The power died within minutes. The hallway lights blinked once, then failed. My room fell into a kind of darkness that felt thicker than night, as if something was pressing against the windows from the outside, trying to get in. I was in bed, wide awake, pulse drumming in my ears. My mother was in the living room, finishing her last box. I could hear her footsteps, and then I heard something else, a knock, soft, deliberate, coming from the glass. I turned my head slowly. The curtain shifted, barely, as if moved by a breath of air. And I knew it was there again. I told myself not to move, not to look. Not this time, but my body betrayed me. I stood and approached the window. 1 step, 2, lightning split the sky, and I pulled the curtain back. He was there, no longer hovering, no longer distant, just inches beyond the glass. His face was clearer than ever. Not monstrous, just wrong. Pale, eyes wide with the kind of expression children wear when they don't understand why they've been left alone, lips parted like he was trying to say something but no sound came. And for the first time he moved. His hand lifted slowly and pressed to the window pane. My breath caught. The glass fogged under his touch. I could see the outline of his fingers, and beneath them, the faintest crack forming in the surface. Behind me, my mother shouted. Arms wrapped around my waist and yanked me back, just as the window shattered inward with a scream of wind and rain. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, and cold air rushed through the room like a tidal wave. There was nothing outside. No balcony, no figure, no boy. Just the storm, howling. We left the next day. The landlord didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew. Years have passed since then. I'm grown now, far from that town, far from that building, but I still remember his face. Not just during storms. Sometimes when rain taps against the window at night, I wake and think I see him, just for a second, staring from the other side of the glass. I've learned not to look for too long, but sometimes I think he still wants to say something, or maybe he's just waiting for someone to let him in. We had only been in the house for 3 weeks when it happened. The move had gone smoothly. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, with its neatly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, and polite nods from neighbors who never quite made eye contact. The house itself was a modest 2-story with creaking floorboards and a back porch that opened onto a small patch of lawn, framed by a few sickly trees. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a fresh start. My wife loved it. She said the silence helped her sleep, and for a while I believed it helped me too. Then came the night I woke up just after 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why. No noise, no dream I could remember. Just a sudden pull from sleep, like something in the air had shifted. The bedroom was dark except for the faint orange glow of a street lamp leaking in through the curtains. My wife was lying beside me, curled up, her breathing deep and even. I got up and padded softly down the hall for a glass of water. The house was cold, the kind of cold that settled into the joints, the kind that made silence feel heavier. I stood at the kitchen sink for a moment, drinking, listening to the wind nudge the corners of the siding. That's when I looked out the window. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows. The glass was fogged slightly, and the yard was wrapped in moonless gloom. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape came into focus. A woman, standing in the yard. Her hair moved slightly with the breeze. Her arms hung limply by her sides, and her face, though hard to see, was tilted upward, staring at the bedroom window. Staring directly at our bedroom window. I froze, the glass still in my hand. There was something familiar about the figure, the shape of her shoulders, the way she stood. It wasn't just any woman. It was my wife. The same posture, same hair, same nightgown she had worn to bed. I turned back toward the stairs and climbed them quickly, not running but close to it. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open. She was still there. Asleep, unmoved, exactly where I had left her. I stood in the doorway for a long time, heart pounding, listening to her breathing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I walked slowly to the window and looked down into the yard. It was empty, just wind and grass and darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I didn't mention it. I convinced myself it was a dream, a waking hallucination, maybe the result of stress and lack of rest. I told myself that moving to a new home, especially one this quiet, could play tricks on the mind. But something deep in my gut said otherwise. Something told me the woman I saw in the yard wasn't just a dream, and that whatever she was only getting started. After that night, I tried to forget what I had seen. I told myself it must have been a half-formed dream, a vision lingering on the edge of sleep and waking. I didn't want to believe the alternative, because the alternative didn't make sense. And yet, no matter how many times I repeated the logic to myself, the image of her standing in the yard wouldn't leave me. It clung to the inside of my head like frost on a window. A few days passed without incident, but something between us shifted. My wife hadn't changed, not outwardly. She still smiled at me the same way, still drank her tea before bed, still wrapped herself in the old grey blanket she loved. But I found myself watching her more closely, listening for subtle differences, how she moved, how she breathed, how she blinked. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a mistake. Maybe proof that she was still the only one. Then came the second time. It was just after 2:30 a.m. I was in the living room, unable to sleep, staring blankly at the muted television. The storm outside was gentle, not loud, just a low, steady patter of rain and wind. I heard something, a soft creak, like pressure on the front step. I muted the TV completely, leaned forward. Then I saw her, through the narrow window by the door. She walked past slowly, outside. Not hurried, not lost, just moving as if she belonged there. It was her. Same grey blanket, same nightgown. But she didn't look up at the window. She didn't seem to notice anything at all. She moved like a shadow, like something drifting through a memory. My mouth went dry. I stood, approached the door and pressed my ear against it. No sound except the rain. When I opened it, the porch was empty. I turned around and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. She was still in bed. The blanket was wrapped tightly around her, her chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Her brow twitched slightly as if lost in a dream. I stepped closer, half expecting her to vanish the moment I touched her. But she didn't. She was warm, solid, real. That's when the dread set in, because if she was here, what had I just seen? And more importantly, why did it look so much like her? The sightings didn't stop. Over the next week, I saw her at least 3 more times, each time in a different place. Standing at the end of the upstairs hallway, sitting on the porch swing in the middle of the night, passing the kitchen doorway in my peripheral vision, always quiet, always just barely out of reach, never interacting, never acknowledging me. My wife, the real one, never noticed. She slept through the nights without disturbance. She laughed at my tired eyes, told me I needed better rest, maybe less caffeine. I smiled back and said nothing. Because how do you tell someone that something wearing their face is walking around your house at night? And how do you prove that the person sleeping next to you isn't the only version that exists? I became consumed by it. During the day, everything appeared normal. My wife hummed while folding laundry, made jokes about the slow internet, and danced barefoot across the kitchen tiles when she thought I wasn't watching. But at night, when the house fell quiet and shadows settled into their corners, I waited for her to appear again. Not her, the woman I married, the other one. I stopped sleeping altogether. I started setting alarms every 2 hours, kept a camera by the nightstand. I placed small strips of tape across the bottom of the doors, hoping I might catch one disturbed. I even left the back door locked with the key removed entirely. Still, she came. And then one night, something changed. I woke to the sound of slow footsteps above me. That didn't make sense. Our bedroom was on the top floor. I checked the bed. She wasn't there. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and ran into the hallway. The door to the attic, a space we'd never used, stood slightly open. I climbed the creaking ladder and pulled myself into the dark, stale air above. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it was empty. But in the far corner, behind a crumbling insulation board, I saw it. A handprint. Small, pale, perfectly outlined in dust. Not smudged, not accidental. Placed. I stared at it, breath caught in my throat. The shape, the spread of the fingers, it wasn't mine, and it wasn't fresh. Around it, the dust had begun to settle again, like it had been there for days, maybe longer, waiting to be noticed. The next morning, I didn't tell her. Instead, I drove into town and went to the records office. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe proof I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe a story like mine, something buried under layers of renovations and new paint. It didn't take long. The house had belonged to another couple 5 years before us. Quiet people, no children. The file was thin, almost unnaturally so. Just names, dates, sale agreements. But then I found a note buried at the bottom of the folder. It was a scanned copy of a police report, dated 6 years ago. The husband had reported strange behavior in his wife. He claimed she was being duplicated, his word, not mine. That he'd seen her in 2 places at once, heard her voice downstairs while she slept upstairs, caught glimpses of her reflection moving independently in the mirror. He said she wasn't always warm, that sometimes she felt cold, hollow, empty. The report ended abruptly. She disappeared a few months later. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no goodbye. The husband left town shortly after. I sat in my car for a long time. That night I didn't sleep. I waited by the window, lights off, phone in hand, staring at the dark street below. The real her was asleep upstairs, but at 2:47 a.m. she walked by again, outside, wrapped in the same blanket, looking up at our window and smiling. We were supposed to leave that weekend. After everything, the sightings, the attic, the police report, I convinced her we needed time away. A short trip, a break from the house, from whatever had settled into its walls. She agreed, although I sensed confusion behind her smile. She didn't understand the urgency. She hadn't seen what I had seen, not fully. She left the night before, taking the car to visit her mother in the next town over, planning to return for our departure the next morning. I stayed behind to finish packing, telling myself it was almost over. Just one more night. But deep down, I knew something wasn't finished. The house felt different without her. Not safer, heavier. Like the air had grown thick, like the rooms were watching me instead of holding me. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of wind against the windows carried meaning. I kept the lights on, all of them. I didn't go near the attic. I didn't open the curtains. Still, she came. At 2:12 a.m. I heard the front door creak open. Not slam. Not rattle. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. Then came the sound of bare feet on wood. Not heavy. Not rushed. I stepped out into the hallway, heart hammering, and there she was. Standing at the end of the corridor, bathed in the faint yellow light of the lamp behind her. The same nightgown. The same posture. But she didn't speak. Didn't move. She just watched me, with eyes that looked exactly like hers but felt like a stranger's. And then, it wasn't loving, it wasn't familiar, it was knowing. She turned and walked downstairs without a sound. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from her. Just got to Mom's. Love you, night. The blood in my body turned to ice. I ran downstairs, but the living room was empty. No door open, no trace, only silence. And something else. On the mirror in the hallway, a faint smudge, the outline of a hand, slowly fading in the warmth of the room. But it wasn't on the outside of the glass. It was inside, like something had pressed against it, from the other side. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I didn't pack. I left the house without looking back, locking the door behind me as if it mattered. She returned later that day, cheerful, unaware. I told her nothing, just that the trip was cancelled. She didn't question it. We sold the house 2 months later. We moved far away. New city, new walls, new life. And for a while, it worked. There were no more sightings, no more footsteps, no more faces that looked like hers in the dark. But sometimes when I pass a mirror in the hallway, late at night, when the lights flicker just so, I see 2 reflections. One mine, and one standing just behind me, smiling. The apartment came furnished, but barely. A second-hand couch that sagged in the middle. A wobbly table with one mismatched chair. Yellowing blinds that rattled when the wind pressed against the windows. It was small, old, and smelled faintly of dust and forgotten things. But it was cheap, and I didn't have many options. The landlord had said very little when I signed the lease. Just that the previous tenant had passed away in the unit. Natural causes, nothing dramatic. And that most of the furniture had been his. I nodded and signed anyway. I needed the quiet. I needed somewhere to disappear for a while. The VCR was tucked in the back of the kitchen cabinet. I found it while unpacking, nestled between an old extension cord and a box of expired batteries. It was heavy and warm, the kind of grey plastic you only saw in the early 90s. The label had peeled off long ago, and dust had settled into every groove. It looked dead, just another relic of a decade no one missed. I almost threw it out. Something about it, maybe nostalgia, maybe curiosity, made me keep it. There was no remote, no cables, just the machine. That night, the power went out. The entire building blinked into silence around 11 p.m. I lit a candle and sat on the couch, listening to the wind scrape its nails across the windows. The silence felt deeper than usual, the kind that hums in your bones. I found myself staring at the blank television screen. Just for something to do, I plugged the VCR into the wall. I didn't expect anything to happen. But the moment it connected, a soft click echoed from inside the machine. Then a low mechanical whir, like something waking up after years of sleep. The power light glowed red. Then it started playing. I froze. Maybe there had been an old tape inside the VCR I just hadn't seen. Maybe it was left behind by the last tenant. Maybe, and this seemed less likely, but I needed to believe it, I had imagined the whole thing. A stress dream triggered by the dark, the storm, and the strangeness of sleeping in a dead man's apartment. Still, I didn't touch the VCR again for 3 days. But it didn't matter, because on the 4th night, it turned itself on. I was in bed when I heard the click. The soft, mechanical whir. I knew the sound instantly. I sat up in the darkness, heart already pounding. The television glowed faintly from the living room. It was playing again. Another tape. I didn't press play. I didn't even walk over. The footage was darker this time, still grainy, still the same room, but now the camera angle was slightly different, lower, as if it had been moved. And I was there again, sleeping. But I wasn't still. I twitched, turned, then sat up suddenly in the frame, my eyes opened, wide, staring directly into the lens. I felt bile rise in my throat. The version of me on the screen didn't blink, didn't breathe, just stared, like he knew I was watching. Then the screen went black. No end, no fade out, just gone. I unplugged the VCR, yanked the cord from the wall like it had burned me. The red light faded, the machine went silent, but the next night it turned itself on again. Each time I unplugged it, it came back. Each tape showed something new. Sometimes it was me, just standing in the kitchen, or brushing my teeth, or staring at the front door, always in silence, always from a new angle I hadn't noticed before. I started checking the apartment for cameras. Nothing. I tore apart cabinets, vents, light fixtures. I opened walls, ripped up floorboards. There was nothing. No wires, no hidden lenses, just dust and old nails and the endless creaking of a place too small to hide secrets. And yet, the tapes kept coming. What frightened me most wasn't that someone was watching. It was that the person in the tapes didn't act like me. He looked like me, wore my clothes, moved the same way. But something was wrong. He was emptier, slower, more deliberate. He blinked too rarely, smiled too slightly, and sometimes he would just stand there in one spot for minutes at a time, as if waiting for something I couldn't see. I started having trouble sleeping. Every night, I'd wake up unsure if I was still me, or if I was now the one being recorded. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the darkened screen of the TV, and it wouldn't look quite right. One night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in front of the VCR and watched it turn itself on. And when it did, the tape showed me sitting in that exact same spot, but the other me smiled, and I didn't. It wasn't just repetition anymore. The tapes began to change. Not just in content, but in logic. The images they showed no longer matched reality. Not completely. At first, the differences were subtle. A lamp placed slightly to the left, a coffee cup that had been broken months ago, whole again in the background. But then came the distortions. In one tape, I watched myself enter the kitchen. Same shirt, same movements, and then just stop. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes, unmoving, facing the wall. My head slowly tilted upward until my neck looked like it should have snapped. Then the screen went black. I never did that. Not in real life. Not that I could remember. In another, I was asleep again. But at some point, the figure on the screen slowly opened its eyes and whispered something. No sound came through, but I saw the lips form the words clearly. He's watching too. I rewound that tape a dozen times, trying to see if maybe I had misread it, but it was the same each time. Then came the one that nearly broke me. It started as usual. The screen flickered to life with static, then the familiar image of my living room appeared, slightly tilted as if the camera had been placed on the floor. I was sitting on the couch, just sitting, blank-faced, not watching TV, not reading, just existing. And then someone walked into the frame. Not me, not a copy, someone else. Tall, thin, wearing black. His face was blurred like a smear of static clinging to his head, but his movements were sharp, calculated. He walked behind me, behind the version of me on the couch, and stood there. Just stood, no motion, no breath. The me on the couch didn't react. I leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack a rib. I looked at the angle, the shadows, the way the couch was positioned. And then I realized something that froze my blood. It was the same angle I was sitting at right then, same position, same lighting, same everything. Except I hadn't seen anyone walk into the apartment. I hadn't heard the door. And yet on screen, someone was standing right behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. There was nothing, just empty air. But when I turned back to the screen, the man was gone too. Only I remained, alone. Yet even then, the version of me on the tape didn't move. He just sat there staring forward, as if waiting for something else to happen. I yanked the power cord from the VCR. I smashed it with a hammer, left it in the dumpster 2 blocks away, and the next morning, it was back on the shelf. Not a scratch on it, and a new tape was waiting inside. I didn't play it. Not that day. But that night, the TV turned on by itself. And on the screen, the me that wasn't me was already awake, looking directly into the lens. I stopped leaving the apartment. Not because I felt safe there, far from it, but because I began to suspect that leaving was what it wanted me to do. To leave the space empty, unguarded, vulnerable. I started locking every window, every door, even the interior ones. I unplugged the TV, the VCR, the power strip, taped the outlets shut, but none of it mattered. Every night the screen would flicker to life on its own. And every night the tapes showed more of him, the version of me that wasn't me. He moved around the apartment freely, with ease, like he owned it now, like he belonged. He began doing things I didn't understand, sitting in the dark for hours, rearranging objects, the photos on the wall, the coffee mug on the counter, my shoes by the door. Sometimes, when I'd wake up and walk into the living room, those objects were still in the new positions, as if he'd changed them, and now I was living inside his version of the space. I started filming myself at night, just to prove to myself that I was still in control. One morning I checked the recording. The footage showed me lying in bed. Then, just after 3:03 a.m., something moved. A second version of me stepped into the room. He didn't enter through the door. He just was. One frame, he wasn't there. The next, he stood by the foot of the bed, watching. He leaned down, whispered something into my sleeping ear, and I smiled. I don't remember smiling. I don't remember dreaming. But when I woke up that morning, I felt different. Wrong. That was the first day I didn't recognize my own handwriting. Then came the missed calls to people I hadn't contacted in years. The half-written messages on my phone I didn't remember typing. The bruise on my wrist, deep and purple, shaped like fingers. It wasn't that he was replacing me. It was worse than that. He was merging with me, and I was beginning to lose. That night I sat in front of the VCR one last time. I didn't try to stop it, I let it play. The screen showed my apartment, empty, still. Then the front door creaked open. The camera shook slightly as if it knew what was coming. He stepped into frame, not with menace, not with speed, with calm, with purpose. He walked toward the camera slowly, then sat down close, very close, so that only his face filled the frame, my face, but not my eyes. And then he spoke. No sound came through the speakers, but I didn't need to hear it, because at that moment from behind me I heard something else, a second breath, a second heartbeat, a second presence. I turned. There was nothing. I looked back at the screen. It was black, and I was gone. They found the apartment empty. The lights on, the door locked from the inside. The only thing left was the VCR, still warm, still running. It started at the supermarket. A regular Tuesday. Cold, grey, nothing unusual. I had left work late, hungry and tired, with just enough energy to stop for groceries before heading home. The store was mostly empty, that hour between the dinner rush and closing time where the lights seem too bright and every sound feels magnified. Carts squeaking, fluorescent hum, the distant shuffle of stockers. I had just finished grabbing the last item on my list, a bag of frozen peas, when I noticed it. A presence. Not loud, not obvious. Just that uncanny sense that someone was standing a little too close behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone in line or brushing past. But what I saw stopped me cold. He stood perfectly still at the end of the aisle. Tall, slender, dressed in a long black coat that looked strangely outdated, like something from a distant decade. He wasn't facing me, not exactly, more like angled slightly toward me. And where his face should have been, there was nothing. Not a mask, not darkness. Just smooth, pale skin stretched flat, featureless and wrong. As if someone had sculpted a head and forgotten to finish it. I blinked. For a moment, I thought maybe I was mistaken. A trick of the shadows, bad lighting, fatigue. But when I looked again, he hadn't moved. Still, watching. I turned quickly, pretended to check my phone, then made my way toward checkout, trying not to look back. The cashier scanned my items without a word. I paid, grabbed the bag and headed for the parking lot. The night had grown colder. The lot was almost empty. That's when I heard it, soft, steady footsteps just a few paces behind me. I didn't run. I didn't even turn around. I just walked faster, keys clenched in my hand like a weapon. The sound quickened too. Not running, just matching me, step for step. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the lock, got inside and slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine. The rear-view mirror showed only darkness. I drove home in silence, heart still pounding, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a weird stranger, maybe a man with a skin condition, maybe my mind playing tricks after a long day. But deep down, I knew something had happened. When I got home, the hallway outside my apartment was empty. The lights flickered once as I walked past, but that building was old. It always flickered. I double-locked the door, drew the curtains, took a long shower, and when I finally collapsed into bed, I convinced myself it was over. But sleep didn't come easy, because behind every closed eyelid I kept seeing that face, or rather the lack of one. Not angry, not violent, just impossibly calm. Watching, waiting, and I had the distinct, awful feeling that I hadn't left him behind. The next morning felt normal. Too normal. Sunlight poured through the blinds in stripes. The sound of traffic filtered up from the street below. The smell of burnt toast drifted from a neighbour's kitchen. I told myself firmly that it had just been a strange encounter. Something to file away under urban weirdness. To be forgotten like the dozens of other unsettling things you see once and never again. I almost believed it, until I saw him again. It was 3 days later as I left work. The street was busy, people walking dogs, waiting at crosswalks, talking on phones. I was halfway across the block when I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, standing on the far corner. Not moving, not talking, just standing still. Same coat, same posture, same smooth, featureless face. My breath caught in my chest. I blinked, hard. When I looked again, he was gone. I told myself I was paranoid, that I was still shaken from the grocery store. But then it happened again, and again. At the bus stop, I saw him reflected in the glass shelter behind me. Not directly, just in the warped curve of plastic. But when I turned around, nothing was there. At the laundromat, I glimpsed him standing outside, his blank face just barely visible between rows of dryers. Once I saw him in the mirror of the elevator in my building, standing at the far end of the hallway. The doors closed before I could turn around. Always silent, always still, never close, but always watching. I started walking home different ways, taking side streets, changing my routine, keeping to well-lit areas. I installed a new lock on the door, bought pepper spray, stopped sleeping with the lights off, but it didn't matter. One night I woke up, no dream, no sound, just awake like something had pulled me to consciousness. The apartment was dark and quiet, but the air felt wrong, heavy. I got up, walked softly to the window and pulled the curtain aside. 8 floors up, no balcony, no ledge, and yet on the glass outside there was a shape, a smudge, roughly head-sized, at eye level, and near it a faint, lingering outline, like a handprint, as if something had leaned in from the outside and watched me sleep. I staggered back, heart slamming in my chest. There was nothing outside, just empty air. But that mark, that impossible, undeniable proof, stayed there long after the fear faded. I scrubbed it away with shaking hands. I tried to tell people. A co-worker laughed awkwardly. A friend said I was stressed. My landlord didn't return my messages, and the building's security footage corrupted, they told me. A system error. Of course it was. That was the night I accepted the truth. He was following me, and somehow he wasn't bound by doors or distance. He didn't want to harm me. Not yet. He just wanted to be seen. I stopped dreaming, or maybe the dreams stopped feeling like dreams. There was no more clear boundary between the sleep I craved and the waking hours I feared. It all began to blur into a single stretched-out moment, stitched together by dread, by stillness, by the growing sense that I was no longer alone, even in my own mind. It wasn't just the sightings anymore. Something had shifted. Now I felt him inside. The nightmares were the first clue. I'd find myself standing in my apartment in complete silence. But it was always wrong. The walls were off color. The doors were on the wrong side. The lights flickered too slowly like they were underwater. And every time I would turn to see the faceless one standing behind me, still silent and wearing my clothes. Then I started seeing myself, not in mirrors, not in dreams, in reflections that didn't move when I did, in photographs that captured moments I didn't remember. In short flashes, blink and he was gone, across the hallway, slipping behind corners, entering rooms I wasn't in. Once I woke to find my bedroom door open. I never sleep with it open. Another time I came home to find my laptop powered on and a single document opened on the screen. A blank page, except for one sentence written in the middle, "You are almost ready." I didn't write it. The timestamp showed 3:03 a.m. I was asleep. At least I think I was. The electricity in my apartment began to misbehave. The lights flickered more often. My phone would buzz with no notifications. The hallway light outside my unit turned off only when I stepped beneath it. And there were the footsteps, always around 2 or 3 a.m., soft, slow, deliberate, pacing the living room, then stopping, always just outside my bedroom door. I recorded everything. I bought cameras. I set up motion sensors. I changed the locks again. Nothing helped. The most terrifying moment came when I reviewed a night's footage. At exactly 2:48 a.m., the bedroom camera glitched. For 3 frames, just a fraction of a second, someone else was in my bed, lying perfectly still beside me, no face, just a blank smear where features should have been. And then, gone. I watched it again and again. Each time, the frames remained. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the bathroom with the door locked, lights on, knife in hand, staring at myself in the mirror, trying to memorize the details of my own face. Because I had a terrible crawling thought. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was learning, and one day soon, he would try to become me. I don't remember when I stopped being sure of who I was. Maybe it was the morning I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize my own eyes. They were the right color, the right shape, but something behind them had dulled, like the person inside was pulling away from the surface. Maybe it was when people at work began to act strange. One by one, they started avoiding me. Not overtly, just subtle shifts, conversations ending when I entered the room, eyes flicking past me like I wasn't quite there. One colleague, someone I used to get coffee with, stared at me for a long time one afternoon. Her face went pale and she said, almost to herself, "That's not her." Then walked away. I didn't follow, because a part of me wondered if she was right. My own body began betraying me. Some mornings I'd wake up and find my closet organized in ways I'd never arrange it, or find food in the fridge that I don't remember buying. One night, I woke up sitting at the edge of my bed, arms limp at my sides, staring straight ahead in the dark. The clock read 3:03 a.m. I had no memory of moving. I was slipping. And he was stepping in. The faceless figure had stopped appearing outside. He no longer lingered at windows or watched me from the end of hallways, because he no longer had to. I began seeing him only in mirrors now. He was always just behind me, not moving, not smiling, just present. Once I turned around fast enough to see a blur in the reflection that didn't match my real movements. A twitch of the hand, a tilt of the head, slightly off from what I had done. I screamed. No sound came out. The final confirmation came in the form of handwriting. I kept a journal. I had written in it for years. I knew the feel of every stroke, the rhythm of my thoughts. But lately the entries had changed. Sentences I didn't remember writing, whole pages in a style that felt alien, like someone was trying to write like me and almost getting it right. The last page read, "It's better this way. One of us had to let go." I didn't write that. The signature was my name. But it wasn't my hand. I don't know how much longer I have. I feel like I'm fading, like I'm being rewritten slowly, piece by piece, not erased, just overwritten. Efficient. Permanent. Tonight, as I write this, my reflection isn't copying my movements anymore. It's just staring at me. Still. Calm. Waiting. And I know what it's waiting for. It wants me to blink. Because the moment I do, it will be the one who opens its eyes again. Nobody noticed when I stopped showing up for work. The apartment remained quiet. Rent kept getting paid. A woman still lives there, answers the door, shops at the same store. But her eyes are empty, and no one remembers what her face used to look like.